In Islam, we're taught to honor family ties. But what about people whose family members are abusive? Where do we draw the line? Unfortunately, this situation is not as rare of an exception as many people make it out to be. I'm far from the first person to talk about this topic, but I do think it doesn't get addressed nearly enough for how pervasive the problem is. And there's a lot of ignorance out there still, with the prevailing attitudes often doing more harm than good. Subhanallah. This issue is highly sensitive and highly complex. If the topic of abuse is difficult for you, please click away. Salam, I'm Yusra. I'm training to be a clinical counselor. I volunteered in the child welfare system, and I want to talk about this topic today in three parts. First, let's talk about family ties from an Islamic perspective, the concept of silat raham. Then let's talk about abuse statistics and abuse from a mental health care perspective. And finally, inshallah, let's put it all together to answer our original question: where do we draw the line? So let's start by talking about silat al-raham and the concept of family ties in Islam. Surah An-Nisa, the fourth chapter of the Quran, which translates to the women, is all about the theme of protecting the vulnerable, which is a major concept in Islam. The translation from Mustafa Khattab is, O humanity, be mindful of your Lord who created you from a single soul, and from it he created its mate, and through both he spread countless men and women. And be mindful of Allah, in whose name you appeal to one another, and honor family ties. Surely Allah is ever watchful over you. So, with this stunning, beautiful ayah, we have an amazing setup that starts with the creation of all of mankind and then puts us in the context of family life. We appeal to one another through Allah's name, saying, remember Allah, don't harm me, right? You should fear God. And so there's this setup of we are meant to take care of each other. We are of one another. And we have to live in these family structures where the strong can take care of the vulnerable and everyone works together. And then all of us together are under the watchful eye of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Ar-Raqib. He is watching us. And so if we do not take care of the vulnerable, if we take advantage of them, Allah is watching. He's watching how we will take care of our own because He is the ultimate caretaker and we are only here being tested. We are only being loaned the circumstances that we find ourselves in. Now, the more we learn about Islam, the more obvious it becomes that so many of the rules that Allah has put in place for us are designed to protect the vulnerable. That's their purpose. In addition to the warning found in the first verse of Surah An-Nisa, there are also many ahadith about the importance of Silat al-Raham, which literally translates to connection of the womb. The family is a sacred unit in Islam. Blood is not arbitrary. Your family has rights upon you, and you have rights upon your family. By virtue of Allah placing two people into the same family, they are expected to take care of each other. And we are all expected to take care of each other, mankind, animals, plants, the planet. But your family is what comes first. It's a system where people who are closer to each other can complete each other's needs and help each other out and lift each other up. Now, the dominant philosophy in the West is individualism, which teaches us that every individual should prioritize their own personal needs and isn't responsible for the well being of others. Islam clearly takes a very different stance. We have concepts like fard kifaya. With fard kifaya, as long as a need is being met in the community, we don't all have to meet that need, but it has to be met. If no one is meeting that need, we are all in the wrong for not taking care of the situation. So, on the family level and on the community level, we are expected to take care of each other. We have a moral imperative to do so. And the concept of individualism can sound very nice, especially if you're stifled by a family who doesn't respect you. It can sound very nice on paper to be free to make your own way in life. But this system falls apart once we recognize that a policy of every man for himself very much favors the strong and forgets about the vulnerable. It's a perfect system for people who are privileged and who don't need to rely on others only because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has temporarily granted them that strength. Even, a strong man who doesn't need to, he can work, he can do things, he doesn't need to rely on anyone around him, so he can just make his own decisions and, to hell with everyone else. That person will one day grow old and need to rely on people. Allah humbles people through life. So the idea of family is very meaningful. It's a means by which Allah tests us. How will we take care of each other? Some people have more ability in one way and others in another. And so Allah has designed us in this way where we need to rely on each other to live our lives in ease. And so the idea is, will you be that generous person? Will you be mindful of other people? And that's a big part of what life is about, is that human connection, and the family is the core structure by which we express that human connection. I also want to acknowledge that when Muslim speakers critique Western individualism and talk about how it's led to some extreme attitudes, in the sense of people being too quick to permanently sever family ties and, call all of their family toxic just because of a disagreement or a clash in worldviews, that's very true. There is a tendency for people to get see the appeal of individualism and not want to be dragged down by their family, and just want to kind of distance from them and not talk to them anymore, not answer the phone, move out, and move on basically. And that is indeed not the Islamic approach. However, there's a huge difference between severing family ties because you don't want to be dragged down by them anymore, you don't want to have to take care of them or be responsible for them or deal with them, versus distancing from your family because they don't take care of you, because you are the vulnerable one, they are the ones in power, and they have harmed you tremendously. Those are two very, very different scenarios that often, unfortunately, get conflated and just simplistically grouped together into, oh, you people these days, you all don't uphold the commands of Allah to honor family ties. Here's a very important question to ask: who is the one who truly severed the family ties in the case of abuse? Is it not the abuser who did not honor family ties when they dared to cross the boundaries and violate the very people they were meant to protect? So when the survivor of that abuse then distances and says, I am no longer going to expose myself to this abuse, that person is simply protecting themselves from fitna. They are protecting what Allah has asked us to protect, which it's sad that they have to do that for themselves because their family is the one who should be protecting them. But that just tells you how deeply the error has manifested on the part of the abusive family members. So, going no contact, as it's called, isn't always done for such shallow reasons as, oh, I don't want to deal with my family anymore and I'm just gonna live my life my own way. When it comes to setting boundaries with one's family, it's actually extremely difficult to do. Um, it's often used as a last resort after a person begs repeatedly for their family to respect them. and stop mistreating them and listen to them and see them. And it's emotionally devastating to grieve one's family while they are still alive and to go through life without your family of origin supporting you. So it doesn't make sense to assume that people are always making this decision lightly. Unfortunately, with all of the beautiful ideas we've been talking about, the ayat, the ahadith about silat raham, some people interpret these passages to mean that you have to live with your family if your family is abusive. The entire reason family is so emphasized in the Quran is to establish a structure in which the vulnerable are protected. If that structure becomes the source of danger, then they are the ones who have severed the sacred ties. And the survivor of abuse is simply protecting themselves from fitna by setting boundaries. Well meaning Muslims sometimes generalize their personal life experience to everyone and end up giving out the same broad advice to people in very different situations. I think many Muslims who do this are simply unaware of, sadly, how common abuse is or even what constitutes abuse. So that's what I'll talk about next. Now let's look at the state of abuse in the United States where I live. Because when we talk about cutting off family ties, a lot of people default to the assumption that the powerful person in the family is neglecting to take care of the people in need in the family. Often the example is an adult child who isn't interested in looking after their aging parents. But there is a vulnerability in the adult as well when the adult has been abused by their parents for their whole life, which can really complicate the situation. So, how common is abuse? This is a very difficult subject to broach. In the field of human services, abuse is commonly split into three types: sexual, physical, and emotional. Neglect is sometimes split into physical neglect and emotional neglect. So, with abuse, there is active violation and transgression against the rights of the child. And with neglect, the needs of the child are not being met. All of these forms of violating the most fundamental rights of children are known as child maltreatment. According to the CDC, in 2021, at least 1 in 7 children experienced child maltreatment in the United States. And they add that the real figure is expected to be even higher because so many cases don't get reported, obviously. Think about this national data for a moment. 1 out of every 7 children experienced neglect and or abuse that was bad enough for someone to notice it, to report it, and for that report to then be substantiated by social workers. So if you walk into an elementary school classroom that has 21 students, statistically, at least 3 of them are being maltreated. Now, if you have experienced abuse yourself, then this fact probably doesn't surprise you. But if you are finding yourself struggling to believe this fact, then I want you to know that I worked as a college writing teacher for a few years, and every single semester, without fail, a few of my students would independently choose of their own accord to write their personal essay about the struggles they experienced growing up in a household of abuse or neglect, especially sexual abuse at the hands of their own family members, believe it or not. And these aren't students who, it's not like I surveyed my classroom each semester or brought up the subject myself. These are simply students who, of their own accord, chose to write about this topic. The problem is so much more widespread than people know. And the experience of being a teacher really opened my eyes to the truth. Alhamdulillah, it's the reason I'm studying to become a therapist, inshallah. The reason I'm sharing these statistics is because many people neglect to mention abuse when making generalizations about the rights of the family upon you. without addressing the responsibilities the family has toward you. Or if they do mention abuse, it's often said as an afterthought about an extremely rare circumstance. But sadly, it's not rare at all. Inshallah, I've shed some light on just how prevalent this crisis is in our society. This is fasad, and it has spread, and it's our Islamic duty to speak out against it. The vulnerable are being abused, not just children, but women, the elderly, the disabled, and yes, men as well. In many cases, the survivor of abuse, regardless of their circumstances, is vulnerable. They often have circumstances that prevent them from leaving, but even if they don't, merely being exposed to abuse makes you vulnerable. We are all vulnerable to cruelty. Cruelty affects us, it destroys the dignity that Allah has put in our souls. And for that cruelty to come from the very people who were tasked with nurturing us makes it all the more despicable. Maltreatment is common enough that when you address a small room of people, you should assume that a few of them fit into this so-called extreme rare exception scenario of having been mistreated by their family. This is not hypothetical, this is happening. I pray these statistics can change the way we talk about family ties and inspire us to fight against abuse. Because, again, a major reason we're commanded to uphold the sacred bonds of family is so we protect the vulnerable. Because children and vulnerable adults cannot fend for themselves outside of the structure of a family. But if the family ties themselves are what's oppressing the vulnerable, then they aren't doing their job, they're doing the opposite. So we shouldn't let people with loving families tell people who have been horrifically mistreated that they should be more patient, more forgiving with their relatives. We shouldn't twist and weaponize the beautiful ayat and ahadith about protecting the vulnerable. We shouldn't use the beloved Prophet's words, alayhi salatu wassalam, to blame the victims and shame them into showing their abusers more grace. That cannot be what Rahman Rahim wants from us, and Allah knows best. There are so many warnings in Islam. Don't cut off family ties. Don't cut off family ties. Honor and uphold what Allah has made sacred. I believe, and Allah knows best, that these warnings are addressed to the powerful. They are addressed to the people in the family who could make it on their own. Don't cut off family ties. Yes, you are strong enough to make it on your own, but the rest of your family isn't. Take care of them. Allah has commanded us to look after each other. We all need each other at different points in our lives. Don't cut off family ties. In the case of abuse, the abuser is cutting off family ties from the survivor by creating such an unsafe environment for them. For the survivor to simply react to that unsafe environment by getting away from it is not for the survivor to cut off family ties, but for the survivor to find peace and safety after those ties have already been severed by the abuser, and Allah knows best. Now that we've established that for so many people, family is associated with profound harm and trauma, we come back to our difficult question from the beginning. Where do we draw the line? How do we honor family ties that have already been snapped by abuse? First of all, what does it mean to honor family ties? If we look at that definition, some people use it to mean obeying your family unconditionally. Let's get one thing straight. Only God is worthy of such obedience. Honoring family ties isn't about obedience, nor is it about having absolutely no boundaries. Healthy families have boundaries, and unhealthy families need even more boundaries to make up for the lack of boundaries and the abuse that occurred throughout a person's childhood. Again, the true definition of honoring family ties comes back down to protecting the vulnerable. If your parents are aging and need help, help them. If you have a child from a previous marriage, be there for them, prioritize them. Don't regard them as an inconvenience to your current goals. You are responsible for them. Always, always, always speak to your family with respect. If they don't speak to you with respect, don't stoop to the level of a shaitan by responding with equal disrespect. Rather, protect yourself from their harm by speaking to them less, but never unkindly. If they don't care to know you, you don't have to give them your heart or even that much of your time, but make sure they're taken care of. You can maintain a shallow relationship in cases of emotional abuse. Eid Mubarak, yes, Alhamdulillah, I'm doing well. You don't have to share a lot of information or make them the center of your life when they consistently hurt and disregard you. If they mistreat you, you can set boundaries. No, you can't stay with us because you were extremely cruel to my spouse and children when you came. If you are now married with a family of your own and your family of origin is who was abusive to you is now attempting to abuse your spouse and children, bear in mind that your duty toward your family also very much applies to your spouse and children, not just your abusive parents. So think of it this way: you are protecting the vulnerable who are depending on you in your family, your spouse, and your children when you set boundaries with your abusive parents. And you are also, in a way, protecting your abusive parents because the more you allow them chances to hurt you, the more opportunities they are getting to earn misdeeds in their book of deeds. So everything you can do to limit the shar is khair. Boundary setting is khair. It makes me very sad that people twist the beautiful Islamic concept of silat raham against the survivors of abuse, when the whole purpose of this concept is largely to protect the vulnerable. We know from the Quran that Allah does not love tyrants or oppressors or people in positions of power who take advantage of the vulnerable and weak. It's also interesting how we have a bit of a double standard based on the form of abuse that a person has experienced. With sexual abuse, there seems to be less of a debate. Not even a shallow relationship needs to be maintained with one's sexual predator family member. And sexual abuse is also a lot more common in the United States than you might think. And people, usually victims of abuse, know their abuser, and it's often a family member. So obviously, you would want to get as far away from those predators as you can, and you would be in the wrong if you continue to expose your own children to those predators. With ongoing physical abuse, seeking immediate protection is also reasonable. Emotional abuse is the more difficult category. It can be just as psychologically devastating as other forms of abuse, yet it's so easy to reframe that it often gets dismissed. People will say, "Oh, how could you not invite this person? Oh, they raised you. Just because they hurt your feelings, don't be so sensitive. Don't hold a grudge." No, words are weapons too. In Islam, words are weapons too. We know the ahadith about people who go to hell for their words, not just their physical deeds, but their words. What you say matters very much. The Quran is words, right? Speech matters. And if somebody is destroying you by making you feel unsafe every time you have a tiny conversation with them, that's not all in your head. That's emotional abuse. And you have a right to protect yourself from that and to limit the exposure to that source of harm. Not only are you not in the wrong for doing that, but it's the right thing to do. I truly believe this. I believe Islam teaches this, and we need to stop uh, weaponizing our beautiful deen against the survivors of abuse in a blind misunderstanding of what it means to uphold family ties. Again, the ones who severed the family ties are the abusers. They are the ones who make the relationship shallow, and the survival strategies that people use to get through this harm, it should not be shamed. And we need to help them, and we need to empower them to take back control over their lives from the real people who have dishonored the family. So, if a person consistently makes you feel unsafe, limit your contact with them, keep it shallow, put up your guard, and keep your distance. For someone to be your family member doesn't give them the right to abuse you. In fact, it makes their unkind intentions toward you all the more damning. Now, if you're in a situation where you have a very bad or difficult relationship with your family member, but they're not necessarily abusing you, they do love you, and it's simply really difficult to talk to them because of a huge clash in perspectives, for example, that's not a case where you should distance yourself from your family. It's tiring, it's hard, but keep at it. Seek reconciliation for as long as they are willing to seek reconciliation. Seek to make them understand your perspective and seek to understand their perspective. Increase your empathy and good deeds toward them. Allah is al-mu'allif bayn al-qulub. He will turn hearts toward each other if they have sincere intentions of doing right by each other. So emotional abuse doesn't mean I really don't get along with this family member and we have a long standing feud. And distancing from emotional abuse doesn't mean never making up with a loved one after you have had a mutual argument. Emotional abuse, rather, is a situation in which one family member is belittling and taking advantage of another. And if that's the case, if you feel like your family member doesn't respect you, doesn't care about you, doesn't see you, and only sees you as an extension of their own ego, if they speak to you with cruelty, insult you, tell you you're worthless, that's the emotional abuse. And so these situations can be really complex and they complicate an already complicated conversation. So, I do recommend that you seek out professional care, mental health care, if you're not sure whether your situation involves emotional abuse, or even if it doesn't, even if your family situation is simply difficult and you could use some help in communicating. Um, Seek guidance from Allah and from the Quran. Pray for Allah to beautify your character and that of your family members as well. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is al-Wadud, the most compassionate, kind, loving. He created these laws about the family system in order to protect the vulnerable. And He brought us Islam in order to protect the vulnerable. So use this beautiful deen of ours to stand up for the abused and to listen to people's concerns rather than distorting Islam into cultural misinterpretations that serve you. We are being tested with our free will. Allah is watching us to see how we will treat each other. Ultimately, He is the protector. We are under His watch and we will return to Him. I pray that I have not said anything incorrect, and anything incorrect that I did say is from me, and anything good that I said is from Allah. I pray that this conversation is able to have a positive effect on anyone who sees it. Jazakumullah khair for listening. Inshallah, we can increase in our ability to stand up for those who need a voice and to always use our own voices in kindness and truth. Assalamu alaikum.